My name is Bill Black, PhD candidate in history at Rice University, and today I'm talking to Elizabeth Catte. You have your PhD in public history from Middle Tennessee State University, MTSU, and you are the author of, so people can see, What You Are Getting Wrong About Appalachia. This is a pretty book, I gotta say.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Published by
Studios.
Oh, yeah, it's nice looking. And you're talking about how, everyone's just getting it wrong, making stuff up. I guess first thing I want to ask you about is why you think, starting with the primaries in 2016, why there was such a disproportionate focus on Appalachia in the news. It did seem like we had this torrent of stories of people going to McDowell County, West Virginia, and other similar places, and to figure out, Trump. Why do you think that is? Why do you think they went to Appalachia?
Yeah, so there's a couple of technical things that we can talk about first, which is things about polling and the way that the primaries were structured that brought a lot of focus to Appalachia. So in early political forecasting, various polling firms predicted that Donald Trump, who wasn't really considered a viable presidential candidate at the time, would do better among people who at one time had registered with the Democratic Party, but were currently either flopping back and forth or were voting Republican. And so this is really common phenomenon in the South and Appalachia as a holdover from when unions influenced politics. So we see that happening, and we see people kind of hedging bets that he'll do well in Appalachia because of that. We also see that by the time that the primaries came to Appalachian states, that there was candidates had dropped out. The pool was a little bit more narrowed at the time. So there's these technical sort of political forecasting reasons that people started to focus on Appalachia. But what really sells the narrative, I think, and what compels people to do these extensive profiles in places like McDowell County, West Virginia, is this narrative of economic anxiety that was really popular in the press in the days of the primaries. And it posited that what was really driving Trump's popularity was, people who were suffering from extreme economic hardships and were just acting in sort of irrational ways because of that. They were making bad choices based on a bad situation that they had found themselves in. And we kind of laugh at this narrative now, when Trump's administration or when his supporters do something particularly vile or racist, we joke that they must be experiencing some economic anxiety.
Right.
But in the early days of the primary season, that was, an incredibly viable narrative for people to attach themselves to. And so that compelled a lot of interest in Appalachia, people finding voters and potential voters and stories that expressed and conveyed extreme economic hardship, and people reacting to that in their political choices.
That idea about economic insecurity, economic anxiety, that's not going away. Even in the invisible Democratic primary going on now, you have people like Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders who want to push back against, they want to say, oh, not all Trump voters are racist. A lot of them are, have these, legitimate economic concerns that drove them to Trump. But I guess a question, though, is, you can find these kinds of people in, the black belt of Mississippi and Alabama, or you can find them in, Nebraska, or, it's not like you say that there's not a single social problem in Appalachia that can't be found elsewhere in the country.
Right, so exactly.
Why do we make it out like Appalachia is somehow unique then?
So, yeah, interesting point. When I started writing this book and when the Trump phenomenon and the economic anxiety phenomenon presented itself, I was actually living in the Gulf Coast of Texas. We had relocated temporarily for work, and I was living in, a poor African American neighborhood, but within a community that was reliably Democrat. So if you wanted to make an argument about economic anxiety broadly, you would also have to look at communities like that and why, for example, people in those areas and those demographics weren't behaving in irrational ways to their economic circumstances. I think what compelled people to attach this narrative to Appalachia is because there's a myth that we see a lot in the region that Appalachia is monolithic and white. And so if you're a reporter or a engaged voter or somebody reading these stories and you don't really want to confront what's happening in politics, you don't want to have to talk about the growing manifestations of white supremacy that are being deployed amongst Trump and his base, then you can go to Appalachia and say, look, not all white people are like this way. These are people who are just reacting badly to their circumstances. They're not being compelled by racism. They're being compelled by really dire economic circumstances. And what was immediately problematic about that narrative was that political reporters know or should know the relationship between poverty and voting behavior. In that, the closer that you get to poverty, the less likely you are to vote by choice, circumstance, or design. So to attach a specific kind of political power to very poor people, people who are experiencing not only economic hardships, but wave upon wave of problems due to the opioid crisis, and to also make a case that they're driving politics at this current moment, the results don't square, for example. And this is true. I think this bears out when we look at the results of the election. There are, significant support for Donald Trump in Appalachia, but the most common type of voter in Appalachia is the non-voter, somebody who doesn't vote or is not civically engaged. And if you look at the election results in terms of raw numbers and square those with number of registered voters or potential voters, the results look a lot different.
Yeah, I mean, it's surreal when you live like I do in a very Republican part of the country, suburban Memphis. Though when it comes to people my age, it's not necessarily true. But the people here are well-to-do, and they're not lacking for work, and they don't have this economic anxiety, and yet full-throated Trump supporters and. They're mainly talking about, being alienated by Black Lives Matter and, immigration of non-white people. And these are issues that they, are very concerned about and are why they really like Trump. And it's almost, I guess the idea is if Appalachia supposedly doesn't have any non-white people, then the white people there can't be racist. Is that sort of the idea?
Yeah, it's complicated. It's complicated because, as most people know, and if you think about, stories like Deliverance and things and stereotypes, sometimes Appalachians are portrayed as very racist. So it's hard to sort of understand how those commingle. But the idea is that Appalachians can be used to talk about racism, but are rarely used to talk about the consequences of racism, if that makes sense. So they can have negative opinions about people of color and deploy bigotry or fundamentalism, but it's thought that these beliefs don't really have consequences because their society and their culture is very homogenous.
So it's just abstract. It'd be like if they hated Martians or something.
Right, exactly. So it has a dual purpose, which is people, more stable white Americans, can point to them and say, oh gosh, look at these racist hillbillies. But they don't really have it's thought that they don't have the power to create negative consequences on the basis of those opinions because they're thought to live in, homogenous all-white communities. Who is their racism going to hurt but themselves? So their racism causes more self-inflicted wounds and sort of tarnishes the reputation of the region rather than participating in, for example, enshrining structural racism, for example. They're not people who are declining not giving, African Americans jobs, for example, on the basis of their race. They're just people who are out there with these abstract ideas, but nowhere to really put them.
So then what do you think is the truth of it? Because I think a lot of people listening to this are saying, well, isn't Appalachia mostly white? Or what might you tell them?
It's hard to generalize about Appalachia because there's Appalachian region within like 13 states, and West Virginia is the only state that's entirely within Appalachia. So you have urban Appalachian centers like Pittsburgh, or where I'm from, which is Knoxville, Tennessee. You have very rural communities. We have a lot of depopulation as well. So we lose an incredible number of young people who leave the region yearly. But what we can say about Appalachia is that the fastest growing populations are Latino and African American, which is something that doesn't get a lot of notice in the mainstream press. And that if you are a person living in Appalachia today, like me, someone on the younger end of the demographic spectrum, it's likely that you are living amongst the most diverse generation of Appalachians. The exception to that is likely to be coal communities like McDowell County, West Virginia, Southern West Virginia, and Southwest Virginia, which has suffered a lot of devastation due to the declining fortunes of the coal industry. But the flip side of that is that at various points in their histories, particularly during the early part of the 20th century, these were the most diverse places in Appalachia because coal camps were very diverse places. So it's interesting to think about how that diversity is lost and what impact it left on these communities when coal camps and coal towns were more diverse. So it's really not a story that you can separate. It's so intrinsic to Appalachia, the story of the rising and fall of various populations and various demographics. But our younger population tends to be more diverse than it's presented in media narratives.
So if you're thinking about what the future of Appalachia is, it's going to be increasingly diverse. And also, I mean, not many are actually coal miners. I mean, and coal miners
exactly.
are coal miners are not necessarily even. You say that coal miners are sort of in a weird kind of middle class, blue collar job, make more money than the really representative, worker in Appalachia should be someone working a dollar store or like a home health worker or something like that.
Yeah, there are far greater number of teachers or hospitality workers or retail workers or health professionals in Appalachia than coal miners. It's understandable, of course, that people fixate on coal when they think about Appalachia, but
And my experience is that, I mean, often people, from when I lived in Kentucky, is that people who maybe didn't even have much of a personal connection to coal still were very, coal seemed to have a meaning for them that was separate from the economic reality of it. I mean, like, yes. They would have, coal keeps the lights on stickers and stuff like that. Anyway, sorry I interrupted you, but.
Oh, no, that's okay. Coal is a history and it's a heritage in Appalachia, and that's distinct from the economic realities and the market realities of coal at this present moment. It's a complicated heritage. There's a lot of exploitation embedded in that heritage, but it's the way people understand their place in the world as well. And we have a long history in the region of supplying energy for the rest of the country. And that's often sort of a labor contribution and a market contribution that is ignored. For example, I'm sure you know that one of the most common narratives of Appalachia is that we absorb just tons of federal assistance and we don't give anything back in return. But that also ignores, the way that the energy market has functioned for a lot of the last century, and the toll that has taken on people and the environment here. So it's complicated, and it's really hard to kind of see people in the mainstream press that are doing a good job differentiating all the layers to coal heritage that there are. There are very good people in the region. Nick Mullins comes to mind who do this. But it's something I think that the media got particularly wrong during the election season.
Yeah, and I want to tie something to, this idea about Appalachia being this region that has historically been a place where capitalists want to extract stuff from it. And you sort of find that there's this perverse way in which the way that we almost racialize Appalachians as almost their own thing, mountain whites, how that actually is used to justify extracting, whether it's coal, whether it's timber, copper. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, it's it's really interesting and kind of a terrible history at the same time. From about the end of the Civil War almost to the present day, the story of Appalachia has been the story of people wanting to take the richness of the land from poor people. And so the most efficient way to make that happen is just to get people off the land. And of course that tracks through earlier history too, and like the forced migration of indigenous peoples in the region. But it becomes tied to a very visible capitalist purpose, of course, after the Civil War. And so to move people from the region, they had to create some kind of myth to facilitate that, because it wasn't enough to say that these people are poor and we need to take things from them. They had to make arguments that it was either in their best interest that they be relocated, or that we were giving them a purpose by bringing capitalism to the region, things of that nature. And one of the strongest and most convoluted myths is that there's, Appalachians are their own genetic specimen, the mountain white. And in fact, just until like about a decade ago, if you went to the Library of Congress and you looked up the subject heading for Appalachia, it literally said mountain white. And it took people in the region, activism within the region and among academics in Appalachian studies, to get that changed and to just say like Appalachian means Appalachian people and not mountain white. But the idea that there was an innate kind of poverty here really helped industrialists make the case that what they were doing in the region and their capitalist experiments had a benevolent purpose, that it was going to bring people into the spirit of progress and give them a place in American society that they wouldn't have otherwise. And so there's lots of arguments about what those genetic and cultural qualities are. Sometimes they talk about Appalachians as, pioneer Anglo-Saxon stock, or sometimes it's Scotch-Irish stock. It kind of ebbs and flows in terms of that, but it's really not left, contemporary conversations that people were having about Appalachia during the election, and particularly after the wave of popularity from Hillbilly Elegy, this idea that there is like an innate pseudogenetic culture in Appalachia that could be used to explain a lot of deficiencies and bad choices and, blaming poverty on the poor and things of that nature. But it's been put to a lot of really disturbing purposes. We were targeted by the eugenics movement in the 1920s and 30s, for example. During the 1970s, after the war on poverty, when the solutions to the federal government brought solutions and those didn't work out, and people said, well, maybe it's this genetic poverty thing again. Maybe it's this genetic, limits that the people have. It presents, and just like the inbred hillbilly stereotypes that track through Appalachian history, and again in the popularity of books like Hillbilly Elegy that tried to pinpoint cultural decline on something within a shared heritage within the region.
Yeah, I want to talk about Hillbilly Elegy a little bit. People love this idea that Appalachians are sort of this insulated. You might have heard this idea that, like, in Appalachia they talk like people talked in Shakespearean English.
Queen's English. Yeah.
Because they say yonder, like Shakespeare said, and it's just it just sort of has been fossilized there for centuries, and it's like. And J.D. Vance, who wrote Hillbilly Elegy, goes in on this lock, stock, and barrel, and he's really influenced by this kind of, what's it called, a Celtic thesis?
Yeah, Celtic thesis.
Can you tell us a little bit about that, and I guess maybe James Webb and how all that influences Vance, and then we can talk about the political.
Yeah. So
implications of it.
just to set the scene for that. So the U.S. Census Bureau has actually let people self-identify their ethnic heritage for I think since the 1990s, and there are other firms that kind of let people answer questionnaires about their ethnic ancestry as well. And so if we use a combination of those sources, and this is like Pew Research, keeps a lot of information about this, we can find that about 1% of the population claims Scotch-Irish heritage, like the entire population of the United States, 1%. The highest is in Appalachia, is in, I think, North Carolina, and it's about 2.3%. And just to give you like the Appalachian example, West Virginia is like 2.2%. So this is not, I mean, it's a real heritage. It's a particular kind of Irish heritage, but its influence in the region is greatly exaggerated. And so you can make the case that, well, this is, people are just reporting their ethnic ancestry wrong. They're just wrong. They don't know what they are. But we can go back, many years, and we can go all the way back to primary source documents and archaeological evidence of the Appalachian quote-unquote frontier, and we can see that, like most places in the United States that experienced early white European settlement, that Appalachia was a fusion of white European ethnic groups. There were people who obviously had indigenous descent and people who had African descent. And so there's a realness to the narrative in the sense that there were people coming over who had that heritage, but it's exaggerated, and its exaggeration often has a specific purpose, and that is to kind of present a whiteness that is almost indigenous in nature, if that makes sense. And it goes lock stock with ideas that people, like you said, have been trapped in the mountains, isolated from the forces of progress, that they're backwards and primitive, that they have, artifacts of older forms of culture like tribalness and warrior culture and honor culture and things like that. Some people, it's complicated because some people in the region do hear this message and believe that is, something that is innate to the region, and they give it good attributes. You know what I mean? Like they say, oh, it makes us really loyal or things like that. So they're trying to recuperate the stereotypes, and you do see that happening. And that would be, Jim Webb would be an example of that, the Virginia Democratic politician who wrote Born Fighting, which is like a recuperation of his Scotch-Irish heritage. And he says that, it's responsible for his successes in military and political leadership. But then you have people who kind of use this to mitigate sort of the destructive forces of white supremacy. So if white people wanted to get out of claiming sort of our shared responsibility for the sins of slavery and that kind of thing, it was useful to create a group of white people that just didn't participate in those systems. And this is what the Scotch-Irish do, or the Mountain White does. And again, it draws on this myth that Appalachians were so isolated that they didn't know slavery was happening. They didn't participate in this. They were just trying their best. Again, this kind of like the repetition of indigenous qualities. They were just living on the land. They had they had an innocent culture, racially innocent culture, and that they didn't do all of the, the things that the elites, the powerful elites were doing. And of course that's really bogus, but that was an argument made by some historians that later turned out to be, white supremacists themselves. So it's complicated, and people have often put this to a purpose to say that there is a certain different species of white people, and that there's various attributes attached to that can explain or complicate, is more often the case, the way that race works in our country.
Right. And then J.D. Vance in Hillbilly Elegy is able to say, because of this, Scots-Irish, ancestry that we have, because of that, we have this kind of culture of poverty where, we just have given up, and, we would rather just sit around and drink and play video games and get our food stamps and not work, and the only thing stopping us is ourselves. And I've heard, and of course the implication of that is then, well, if that's true, then what would that mean about the black inner city ghetto, right? I mean, have people made that connection explicitly?
Well,
You know?
yeah, I mean, so when his book first came out, which was in sort of, I think the summer of 2016, I mean, it got very popular very quickly, but the first wave of press and promotion came from conservative publications that J.D. Vance had either written for or were, familiar with his work and what he was doing. And so
like the National Review.
Like the National Review and the American Conservative, for example, were really gleeful, and they said explicitly, and we can find the quote in the book, but that he had proved that the white underclass had followed African Americans and Native Americans into crippling self-delusion. So there were people who were very, very excited to be able to kind of talk around stereotypes and damaging myths that they had long held about non-white people. And you see this also in the career trajectory of Charles Murray, who is a frequent citation in Hillbilly Elegy for his work Coming Apart, and who is often credited by Vance when he needs to give sort of like academic credibility to what he's writing. Charles Murray, I'm sure you're familiar, came right out of the gate with the bell curve, which linked IQ to poverty and deployed horrible myths about African Americans. And so when he started taking heat for that and was discredited in his academic community, he flipped his script to talking about poor white people in a way that was thought would sort of naturalize or mitigate some of the racist origins and impact of his earlier work. So the case that I like to make in the book is that when you start talking about cultural deficiency, which is how most people talk about sort of white populations, you're never far behind discussions of genetic deficiency as well. And in fact, these points are often in conversation with one another and sort of prop each other up in a strategic way, and that they don't want us to know that, but we can, intelligent observers can see that quite clearly, that often what people say about poor white people and poor white people in Appalachia is a stalking horse for anti-Black racism.
Can you tell us a little bit about who Vance is and sort of how he came to be, how Hillbilly Elegy came to be? Because, I mean, it really did just sort of seem to come out of nowhere. And this book became kind of the Bible of how to understand the election of Trump. And Vance has become this big celebrity, and I think now is maybe contemplating a Senate run in Ohio, or at least has been, I don't know if he's contemplating it, but has been talked up about it.
Yeah,
yeah.
I don't have any specific insider information about J.D. Vance. I just know what he sells in his own biography, which is that he was a person who sort of passed the time between Ohio and Kentucky, that he had a dysfunctional childhood, but received stability from his grandparents, who identify as Appalachian. Later, he joined the military, the Marines, and used that to make his escape from the region, which ultimately landed him in Yale Law School, where he had, a circle of mentors that encouraged him to write this biography of his family, but also of this culture. And then, I just watched, I witnessed it along with everybody else, this popularity that occurred that became attached to these particular narratives about the election. What has been most surprising, I suppose, about his success is the way that he has been embraced by liberals and conservatives alike. His success really kind of manifests on both sides of the political aisle. And Hillary Clinton, in fact, in her memoir, What Happened, endorses Vance's view of Appalachia when she explains why she performed very poorly in Appalachia. She draws in Hillbilly Elegy. So it's something that people really wanted to believe to be true about the region, and that is fascinating to me. And I think the thing that possibly explains it is that this book didn't ask readers to do anything. It didn't ask them to adjust their politics. It didn't ask them to create a specific kind of social change. It asked them specifically, the only specific ask that I can find that is separate from his hypothetical policy suggestions, is that people who read this book not think so much about race. And honestly, I'm not surprised that people, both conservatives and liberals, were really excited to do that, that they, had been exempted by this authoritative and powerful figure to not talk so much about race in our society.
Because I mean, Vance, one of his big lines is he is really offended by the idea of white privilege, because a white kid in West Virginia compared to Malia or Sasha Obama, what does white privilege mean when you have white poverty? And that is something that a lot of liberals do find appealing, at least white liberals. I don't know. Why do you think that is? I guess you're hinting at it earlier, but.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. I had an interview not so long ago, and somebody said to me, as a sort of baiting question, I suppose, like, why can't we just talk about poverty like poverty? Why do we always have to make it, something about race? And I turned it back and said, well, possibly this would be a question that you should talk to an African-American Appalachian about, because I think they would probably tell you that there are certain experiences that we share, but there's certain experiences that we obviously don't, and that are unique to the experience of African American poverty, for example. And you're exactly right that J.D. Vance is a person who's very interested in complicating the idea about universal white privilege, but he often gets it wrong. We can't measure sort of like the elite Black society with the poorest white society. We kind of have to look at outcomes within the region. We have to compare the fortunes of sort of, for example, poor white people from Appalachia with poor Black people from Appalachia. And we see that there are some key differences. For example, white people in Appalachia aren't victimized as much by over-policing, for example. They have better employment outcomes. So things of that nature are true within the region, and comparing somebody, just the poorest of the poor in Appalachia to, somebody quite elite like Barack Obama's daughters is a straw man argument, and I think he knows that.
And I mean, also historically, you can't separate Appalachian poverty from race, because, I mean, you had mines using Black scab workers to break strikes, right, and create animosity between white and Black miners, and thereby preventing. I guess I don't know if this is so much the story in Appalachia as elsewhere in the South, so correct me if I'm wrong, but that often race was used as a way to stall unionization and prevent white and Black workers from uniting and set them against each other instead. Yeah,
you do see that to some degree in Appalachia, but I think, why I won't stop talking about race in Appalachia is because I think Appalachia is a really strong example to use if you want to understand how deeply racialized the experience of poverty is, regardless of what demographic you're speaking of, because many examples of policy, many cultural attitudes about the poor track back to what powerful people and powerful white people think about African American poverty. So even this population in Africa, which is strongly but also incorrectly coded as all white, are put in Appalachia are put to, we either absorb or deflect anti-Black stereotypes. And so if you want to understand how enduring the racialization of poverty is and can be, Appalachia will show you the way.
And I guess we see a parallel as far as the attractiveness of Appalachia of this mythic Appalachia to white liberals. We see that, 50 or so years ago, when people like John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, they used Appalachia as a way to justify the war on poverty and not make the war on poverty seem like something that was going to be just for non-white people. A way of deflecting the idea of like, oh, you're just taking our money and giving it to lazy Black people. It's like, oh no, we're taking this money and giving it to these poor mountain whites and help them become the white people they ought to be.
Yeah, exactly. When the policymakers were designing what the war on poverty would be, I think, and I think I quote this in my book, that one of the policy advisors was posed the question, like, so what color is the war on poverty? Because they, wanted to kind of get to this question about who is really going to be helped with this legislation. And the policy advisor responded, well, color it Appalachian. And it was a way to kind of emphasize that it was about white poverty, but not say that explicitly. So again, we see Appalachians functioning as this sort of like distinct entity. We have our own kind of quote unquote color in those, that framework. But you can also see the impact of what you just said in the way that volunteers responded and the press responded to the region, and the production of this visual archive of white poverty that happens in the 1960s, and the parallel narrative of the civil rights struggle that's also happening at the time, and the way that white middle class and stable and comfortable people responded to images of white poverty as opposed to images that depicted the realities of Black life that were being produced as associated with the civil rights struggle. So that's a narrative that often tracks through Appalachia, that when people don't want to talk about race, when they feel squeamish about talking about race, or when they want to deflect necessary attention to race and the realities of Black life, they often suddenly become obsessed with the people and problems of Appalachia.
I'm not sure that this is going away. I mean, we have now what Ron Howard is going to make Hillbilly Elegy into a movie. How have people been reacting to your book? Do people seem to be hearing what you're saying, or what?
Yeah, so my book is never going to be as popular as Hillbilly Elegy, and perhaps that's a good thing. And to a certain extent, I'm preaching to the choir, because I frame my book quite explicitly as just an act of solidarity between myself and the people in my communities. So I would say that the reaction to my book has been very positive. But of course, again, I have an audience that's been in some ways primed to receive a book like this. I get emails a lot that say, like, I've written, so much of what you said in my head as I've digested election coverage and have heard people talk about Hillbilly Elegy. So I've had conversations with reporters and, in the process of doing press for the book, who have said, I think, you're right about the way that Trump narratives were framed, that we went into our reporting not really believing that Trump would win the election. And we haven't had conversations about how that affected their election coverage, but it's confirmation that there's something deeper there to be discussed. The way that reporters went into the region and didn't, not expecting what happened to happen. And I wouldn't ever suggest that their, coverage swung the election or anything crazy like that. But, it's an important thing to consider when we talk about narratives and repetition of narratives. So, yeah, I think it's, something that some people in the region have found to be sort of an important interruption of power. And that's how I also think about the book, is just, a way that I can disrupt something that you often observe in Appalachia, which is, almost every generation, it seems like we get a new spokesperson, and that spokesperson is often a white male who is, sort of preaching at us, but also presenting this wink-wink insider view of the region for more elite audiences. So, there are people who are like happy to see that power be interrupted, however momentarily.
What do you see happening around you at the local political level? Have you seen people in Appalachia, which of course I know it goes from, northern Alabama to, to New York, or New England. So, I know you can't speak for the whole region, but have you seen people mobilized by Trump's election and also by the media coverage of Appalachia and wanting to posit an alternate idea of what Appalachia is and what it can be politically?
Yeah, to some extent. But I think, one thing that we should acknowledge, and that everyone should acknowledge, is that a lot of the promises that Trump made or are implied in his executive agenda are realities that we're already facing in Appalachia. So if you think that, for example, that there's an enormous amount of political corruption in current politics, or if you think that, a small minority of powerful voters have given us a political outcome, or you're looking at one thing that people often talk about is this sort of like learned complacency that's happening in the public right now. Is there's so much happening that it's often you get a little bit numb to what's going on. So these are all realities that people in Appalachia, and especially progressive people in Appalachia, have lived with for at least 100 years. So it's often the case that we are watching people outside of Appalachia kind of get a small taste of what it's like to be Appalachian, to be blunt. So there's a lot of mobilization as well, but there's also a lot of observation happening too, that we're seeing where people outside of the region are directing their attention and seeing if, how we in the region can help or shine a beacon. I'm an organizer for the Democratic Socialists of America. So we've been doing a lot of, I do a lot of outreach, trying to think about how we can get people who don't vote, make them part of civic engagement, just to increase the numbers. People often ask me, like, what are you doing about Trump voters? And because of course they exist in Appalachia. But my point is that, my hands are full with people who are progressive voters anyway, and people who don't vote. So I just keep it moving. And that's what a lot of people in the region who are politically engaged and progressive are doing. They're just trying to keep it moving. And one of our primary goals is to challenge the Democratic establishment, to kind of force them or compel them to give us better Democratic, progressive, or liberal candidates, because one of the things that has been such a problem in Appalachia is that we're given, candidates like Joe Manchin, for example, who is almost indistinguishable from a Republican candidate, or Jim Justice, who was a Democrat long enough to get elected and then publicly switched parties a year into his term. So we're trying to build power to pressure the establishment to give us better people to get voters out to the polls.
Well, because I know that there are those who would say, well, Joe Manchin, is a conservative Democrat, but he on most of the issues that matter, he votes the way that Democrats would want him to in the Senate, and he's really the best Democrat that you're going to be able to get in West Virginia. And if you try to, because I know there is a woman, what's her name? Swearingen?
Paula Jean Swearingen, yeah.
Who is was a Bernie Sanders supporter. And the fear is like, well, if we try and primary him out, then, then you've just thrown the seat away to the Republicans. What would you say? Yeah,
I try to, in my book, I try to demystify that belief, which is very common that you mentioned. And one of the cases I offer is a politician who was very active around a decade ago. Her name is Charlotte Pritt. But she actually successfully challenged Joe Manchin in a Democratic primary. And instead of the Democratic establishment...
For governor, right?
Yeah, and so instead of the Democratic establishment supporting her as the legitimate primary winner, elite Democrats and prominent Democrats in the state made a coalition to support her Republican challenger. So that's probably a very extreme example, but a lot of that practice still happens on a micro level and a community level, in a behind the scenes way. If you follow my drift, that candidates that are popular, candidates that are populist are not necessarily unpopular. They just their platforms get hijacked or targeted or threatened by the political establishment, which is often an ally of the coal industry. No matter what politics you subscribe to, there's this idea that we have to prioritize economic development. And one of the ways that economic development is prioritized in Appalachia is by courting corporate interests, most often the coal industry, but natural gas as well, and other corporate ventures. And so candidates that support those ventures are very popular with the establishment and will always get the establishment support. And our job is to pressure the establishment to make it very apparent to the establishment that will not stand anymore.
what would be an issue that a populist Democrat but you're in Virginia, right?
I am Virginia.
You said Stanton, Virginia, is that right?
Yeah, Stanton, Virginia.
And so it's true in that part of Virginia as well as in West Virginia that the Democratic establishment's so much tied to coal, or
not so much in Virginia, but I can give you an example of something that might bring in populist voters, people who don't vote. Is in Virginia, we have an issue with natural gas pipelines happening, and it's happening right now. It's happening this very moment, and so the last two Democratic administrations, we had an election a couple months ago, and so we passed the torch to a new Democratic governor, Ralph Northam, and so people are really hungry for a political leader that will challenge natural gas pipelines and challenge the seizing of land by eminent domain, and challenge the I don't want to say Dominion, because that's actually what the power company is called, Dominion Energy, but the corporate influence of energy companies in the state. And as of yet, the Democratic establishment has not been willing to do that. They've sort of rolled over for energy companies, and it's a similar story in West Virginia too, but a little bit more exaggerated. So I think people would be very engaged with a candidate that did show that kind of opposition to the energy market and to natural gas, and to want to decrease the production of fossil fuels in the region. But this is not something that's happening.
So you're occupying kind of a weird place, seems to me, in the public sphere, in that so you have a PhD in public history, which I guess a lot of people may not necessarily know what that is. And MTSU is one of the premier public history programs in the country.
Yes.
What does it mean to have a degree in public history as opposed to just plain history? And how do you see that informing what you're doing, through your book, through the DSA, through also your PASSEL, PASSEL, which is historical consultancy. Yeah. So yeah, I know that's a big question, but
oh no, that's cool. This is in my wheelhouse. So public history has lots of flexible definitions, but I think of it as a way to demystify for people the way that history works in the world. The way that it informs policies, the way that it participates in structures of power. And a lot of people find work who track along with me, find work in, for example, museums or archives or historic sites that interpret history for the public. And I do something a little bit different, which is I just talk about power all the time, and I want to demystify the way that power works for people. But it is an interesting place, but I believe so strongly in this I think it's a Howard Zen motto that history is a weapon. And that history, if you don't understand how to use history as a weapon, it will be used against you. And we can see that a lot. Weren't you involved with the Take 'em Down 901 campaign? Yeah. Likewise with me, I had my own battles, with a lot of other people at MTSU too, this idea that we needed to have a conversation about Confederate heritage in the South and on public places like campuses and courthouses and things like that, and to compel those conversations using history and using a more nuanced version of history than just lost cause narratives. So that's the work that I do. I have a small consulting business with my partner, and what we aim to do with that is to create the tools necessary to help communities explore their underrepresented history a little bit better. So we do primarily work on themes involving labor history and African American history, to kind of fill those narrative gaps that exist in communities. Because often what we think about is, we don't interpret history because these episodes have been forgotten or that they're just non-existent in the area. But closer to the truth is the fact that they've been suppressed. And this is especially true of African American history. So again, with my book and what I do in my other professional life is I want to interrupt power and interrupt this process of forgetting where our history is taken from us. I think, to understand your history is to understand your place in the world. And that can be a very powerful thing. It's often a contentious and complicated and dispiriting process of understanding, but there's power at the end.
Yeah, you remind me. One of my little things I like to harp on sometimes is how much I promise this connects to what you were just saying, but how much the story of Texas barbecue is kind of fictively made into this white story, and I think it has a lot to do with the fact that people typically, will fly to Austin and eat at Franklin Barbecue and then get on their plane and go back to New York or whatever. When like East Texas has a rich history of barbecue in Houston that's very influenced by African American culture, especially people who their ancestors were either from East Texas or from Louisiana, and often the way that barbecue is portrayed as just this kind of German diaspora, dry rub Austin thing writes out a lot of experience. But anyway, that's my little rant about that. But I am just curious what it means brass tacks for you to help African Americans or unions to tell their stories. What does that actually mean? Are you like helping them? Histories or writing histories, or what are you doing?
So I'll give you an example of our current project that we're working on now, which is to assist in the development of a historic African American recreation area in the George Washington National Forest, which is in Allegheny County, Virginia, well within Appalachia. And if so, African American history in Appalachia tends to suffer from invisibility in a big way. And especially what we see, not just in Appalachia, but nationwide, is that a lot of the stories that people want to tell, or that are given the tools to tell, I should say, the support to tell, are painful. They are rooted in trauma. There's this, performative trauma that has to occur when people are telling stories about African American experience. And this is, the stories that we're trying to tell about this recreation area that was once segregated reflect that as well, but they're also stories where people can talk about joy. They can talk about belonging, stories that are attached to particularly like African American place in the wilderness are very hard to come by in the region. I mean, of course, they exist in the hearts and minds and memories of people, but institutionally, they're scant. So what we do in that regard is we are giving African American community groups the tools to to bring historic recognition to this site. And that means that we're working with the U.S. Forest Service to, require the appropriate permissions to place the site on the National Register of Historic Places. We're teaching oral history workshops in the community so that people within these groups can interview one another and capture their stories and put out, booklets and produce things of that nature. We are helping them find funding. So really, we're just a companion to that work. We're not really leading it or directing it, but we're, when they come to us and they say that they need help, they're interested in exploring grant funding, we're ready to get some grant funding. We'll make suggestions, or if they say, for example, we're kind of confused by the bureaucracy of the National Register process, or no one at the U.S. Forest Service will, return our, queries, then we'll step in. And so we're going to do some of the more bureaucratic work in that respect to bring historic recognition to the area.
That's great.
Mm-hmm.
You're doing the Lord's work.
Well, and the good thing is the community finds it like very rewarding as well. The site means so much to so many people, white or black, and everyone has particular memories of the site. And I think, when you incorporate that sense of belonging and attach people's memories and identity to place, it works really well in Appalachia when you tell stories about people's love and stewardship for the land. You can often talk about many contentious or difficult topics rooted in that spirit of understanding people's relationship to their place. And so it's been great.
And that is great. Well, what we need is, we have all these people with history PhDs who are underemployed, right? Who are, I really think we ought to have a second and non-racist like WPA.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I mean, there's an aching and a need for that kind of work. It's not like it's not like there's no work to be done. It's just a matter of what we're choosing to, spend resources on. And I mean, there's plenty of stories to be told. And
yeah, I mean, we are, my partner and I, are 100% on the same page as you. We proceed in the spirit of the WPA and the CCC. And we do a lot of our work on a pro bono basis. And that I like to think that we're good people, but also it's because, there's often not very much difference once you get through taxes and payments and things like that, right, between taking a little bit of money and taking no money at all, because you pay it all out anyway. So we do a lot of pro bono work just because it's good for the community, and it just makes it easier in terms of tax season and things like that. But if we could work through if we could organize something like that and make sure that people who do work like us get a little bit of money and the community gets a little bit of money. I think, one of the shocking things, and I'm sure you experience this too, is how little, what can be done on so little. And that if people, just, up their attention and up their commitment to projects like this, it would make a world of difference.
Yeah, I had a story in the Atlantic a few days ago about this sort of trope that a lot of former slaves told WPA workers about how Lincoln supposedly came to their plantations and in disguise, and I just had a line in there that actually my editor asked me to add, just explaining why these people were going around the country collecting stories from former slaves, and I just said, they were employed by the Federal Writers Project, which was designed to put writers to work and enrich American culture. And I had multiple tweets and emails, people like, what? We just did that? Just that I can't believe that we would do such a thing. It's like, there's no reason we can't do it again.
I know it would take such little in terms of raw material for funding, and the Federal Writers, talking about the Federal Writers Project was important to my book too, and I just think that it's it's still a tremendous model that would work well not only for the country but particularly in Appalachia. This old kind of social safety net and social democracy that can be employed through make work programs that are, for the common good.
Well, I feel like I've taken up enough of your time, but I just want to plug again what you are getting wrong about Appalachia. Also going to link below. You've been interviewed by the New Republic recently, so we'll link to that, and also a fun leftist Southern magazine called Scalawag that is doing a series on people who are combating white supremacy, and they interviewed you for that. We'll link to that.
Oh no, that wasn't me. That was another Elizabeth.
Do what now?
That wasn't me. That was another Elizabeth that works in Whitesburg. People thought that was me for some reason, but I was interviewed for Scallywag about leftist podcasts. So I think there's some confusion occurring. Okay. So I talked about leftist media, but there's white supremacy. I talk about white supremacy a lot, but there are two. There are two very cool Elizabeths in Appalachia. So just be warned.
I think there's room for that.
Yeah, there's definitely room for that.
Okay. All right. And is there anything else you want to tell our listeners and viewers, or anything else you want to plug? Or
I'm kind of plugged out right now. I've had my little media blitz, so I'm quite satisfied. And anyone who reads the book, I'm very grateful for it. And I'm easy to contact in case people want to share their thoughts.
Yeah, you're on Twitter at Elizabeth Catte. That's Catte. And well, thanks for coming on and talking. It's been great.
Yeah, thank you so much. Y'all take care.
You too.